Good afternoon. I'm Nicole Mag, the Vice President of Operations for UMRC in Porter Hills. I'm here today to provide an operational update. If you remember, way back at the beginning of the year, we provided a communication calendar for both Porter Hills Village and Cook Valley. And in that calendar, we outlined all of the touch points for communication throughout the year to include resident council and meetings with executive directors. And at the end of that calendar was meetings set up with the executive team. So at the beginning of the year, you had the opportunity to hear from Steve Fedico, the CEO, as a organizational update. And then in the summer, we had planned for myself and Lori Potter, the COO, to provide you an operational update. And in late fall, Kim Hoppy, the CFO, was planning to come and provide a financial update. Well, obviously, like many of our best laid plans, COVID has changed our ability to do that for you in person. But it was really important for Lori and I to make sure you still had this update, and we decided that doing it virtually would kind of meet that commitment. Additionally, Kim has committed to do the same thing, and she will come in late fall after the audit results are in to provide the financial update, maybe in person, but likely virtually, depending on the pandemic. So I'm planning to kind of go over high level the operational initiatives that we started the year with, where we are currently, and where we'll head for the next year. And then Lori is going to provide an update on strategic planning, master planning, and our diversity and inclusion work. So let's get started. So where were we at the beginning of the year? Myself and the executive director teams had sat down and created goals for the operations team for the full year of 2020. And those goals centered around resident survey project, survey and compliance and quality goals that we had identified, a policy and procedure integration project, projects around dining optimization and therapy optimization, and implementing various household model initiatives, and a lot of deferred maintenance and project work. And those were great goals, and then COVID happened. And we all know that everything stopped and changed at the beginning of March in relation to COVID. So where are we at today? Those were kind of our goals for the entire year, and on really March 10th, we had to stop and reprioritize and refocus, and our operational world really became all about COVID. So when COVID hit, the things that we implemented and the things that we prioritized were making sure that we had identified on-site teams, who they were going to be. We needed to secure personal protective equipment for both UMRC and Porter Hills. We needed to procure and set up telehealth and digital visiting capabilities. We needed to develop dining programs, which included delivering all of our meals, which has actually included 125,000 meals delivered since March 1st, just on the west side. We had to create communication plans and wellness checks, and since the beginning of March, we've done 25,000 wellness calls and check-ins on the west side alone. We had to close our common areas, our pools, and our gyms. We had to develop delivery system for goods and groceries and mail. And I think that totals a little over 2,000 deliveries to date. And the list of things that we needed to do in response to COVID, goes on and on. And so we've really spent the last 6 months since the beginning of March adapting to COVID and doing what was needed in this global pandemic. I did want to provide you an update on our current cases so far. So on the west side, since the beginning of March, we've had 20 total cases. 14 of those being staff and 6 of them being residents. We have 10 total communities on the west side, so those are dispersed throughout those communities. And just as a reminder, you can find current COVID counts anytime, day or night, on our website. Those are updated every single day, so that will be your current count for the number of cases that we have. We do currently have a dedicated unit at the HRC that is dedicated for COVID positive residents and patients. That currently sits empty. We do not have any current positive residents or patients. I also wanted, in light of COVID, to just briefly go through the current executive orders. I know that you have heard these multiple times, but even myself, I find them confusing and conflicting. So I wanted to give just a current state today as to what executive orders we are operating under. So Executive Order 156 is the order that restricts all visitors into all levels of senior living. That one is set to expire on August 31st, but we've seen many times that same order be reinstated. So we're not necessarily expecting changes to visitors after August 31st. Executive Order 160 is the executive order that requires all non-essential employees to work from home. It requires our indoor gyms and indoor pools to be closed. It requires any gatherings to be less than 10 people indoors, and they must be socially distanced and wear masks. Any gatherings outside must be 100 people or less, and we also must follow social distancing and mask rules. There's no actual expiration for this executive order, and this executive order follows the Michigan Safe Start map. Currently in Kent County, we're in the medium to high risk, so we would have to substantially move through that Safe Start map for this order to change. Next is Executive Order 165, and that is the one that declares Michigan in a state of emergency, and that goes through September 4th at this point. And lastly, Executive Order 169 is the one that only applies to our care areas, so assisted living and skilled nursing. And that's the one that prohibits any communal dining or any communal inside or outside activities. It has certain notification requirements for COVID positive residents, and it requires us to have that dedicated unit if possible. And that one expires on September 7th. So I know that these executive orders can be confusing and conflicting and difficult to follow. If you have any questions about these executive orders or why we're doing a certain thing a certain way, please feel free to reach out to your community leader and get clarification. So also with COVID, it's required us to communicate in very different ways. Perfect example is me coming to you digitally today. So we've used technology to communicate virtually in many different ways. We have YouTube channels, we've done town hall updates, so we've really started to maximize our use of technology in communicating. We also have done regular written updates. I encourage you, if you haven't already, to follow us on Facebook. There's a lot of really fun, uplifting Porter Hills and UMRC information that comes out there. And also to follow the website, both for our notifications and for updates. Wellness engagement has also been a huge focus during COVID. Shore to Shore, we do have an independent living engagement team, which works really hard to try to stay creative and meet the needs of the residents while obeying and staying within the rules of the executive orders. I've seen some really cool things, cardio drumming and outside yoga. I know we have some upcoming block parties, and we've had parades and outdoor concerts. We've developed YouTube channels that have some really fun content, weekly devotionals, weekly puzzles, the list goes on and on. So wellness and engagement teams have continued to work really hard during the COVID outbreak to meet those needs. And now we start to think about winter prep and a potential second wave and what that'll look like. So we're beginning to develop our plans around wellness and engagement as we all have to start to come indoors, and how we'll prepare as an organization for a potential second wave of COVID. So around COVID, I just want to really say that our teams are working really hard within the guidance of CDC and CMS, MDHHS, and the governor's orders to continue to meet the needs of our residents, both their safety and security, as well as their engagement and wellness needs. And I really, around COVID, want to thank you. I think it's important to note that this has been an incredibly difficult time, not only for residents, but for our team members as well. And the reality of this is that we won't know the emotional impact for a long time. And we also don't know when COVID will end. But what I do know is that kindness and support and your supportive approach has really carried us through this. Your kind words, your messages, your notes, they're the things that keep our teams going through these exhausting and challenging times. So thank you for that. So that's COVID. So where are we headed and what are we focused on outside of COVID? Like I mentioned, in March, we were really pretty singularly focused on COVID. And in the last 30 to 60 days, we've been able to start to focus on other areas. And our primary areas have really been staffing and occupancy. So all of you know that staffing was a pretty significant challenge in West Michigan and in the senior living industry heading into COVID. But COVID has really exacerbated that challenge. So we have worked to develop a robust staffing, recruitment, and retention plan that we will be working on in the coming months. And then occupancy. You can imagine that COVID has not helped occupancy in the senior living industry as a whole. We've seen a significant dip in occupancy across the senior living industry, and UMRC in Porter Hills is no different. I will tell you, compared to our peers and compared to others in the nation and the state, we are doing fairly well with occupancy. But we have to continue to focus on how we move people in, how we do that safely, what that looks like, and how to make sure that we're meeting the occupancy needs of our communities. So that is the beginning of our forward-looking focus. And as we start to potentially look out 6 to 12 months from now, we're starting to look at bigger projects outside of COVID. So we're starting to focus on goals that are larger than just COVID, occupancy, and staffing. And one of those goals is deferred maintenance and significant projects. So for the last 12 months, we've invested over $5 million on the west side and into the buildings. Specifically, the majority of those dollars have gone to Porter Hills Village and Cook Valley. So at the Village, we've completed our garden roof project. It looks beautiful. I can't wait for all of you to see it someday. We've invested a lot in kind of the boring things like mechanicals behind the walls and underground at the Village. And we're beginning to start the porch project for the garden apartments as well. At Cook Valley, we've invested significantly in decks and driveways and outer dwelling deferred maintenance. We have the theater project coming in the fall, and we're looking to do some other deferred maintenance, including the signage out front of Cook Valley. We're also going to focus on food service, and we're working on some increased technology that will allow for online ordering, for menu viewing, and nutritional values to be listed. We're looking at our venues. Those of you that are in garden apartments, you've seen kind of a reimagining of the garden cafe. We're hoping to do that in other areas as well. And then really optimizing our menus and services in dining. Also considering various meal packages and what they could look like in dining as well. We have a project related to therapy, and this will allow us to bring therapy in-house and really maximize the quality and the reimbursement in our care areas where we use therapy. Engagement and wellness, so we have a goal to have a greater investment in those two areas to provide increased quality, more offerings, and a variety of engagement and wellness initiatives. And lastly, we have a technology project, and this includes a variety of items that we expect to invest in, bringing CareMerge to the Village, bringing virtual reality to some areas, increasing our iPads in other areas, virtual screening stations for all of the staff and vendors who need to be screened every single day, and providing more technological tools for our team members. So in a nutshell, we started the beginning of the year with a really well thought out operational plan, and then COVID hit. And it required us to really change our focus and be laser focused on the global pandemic. We've started to feel in the last month or so that we can broaden that scope to include those other operational goals that I talked about. To say this year hasn't gone according to plan would be a pretty big understatement. But I think the truth of the matter is that our strength really lies in our ability to adapt and to change. And this pandemic has taught us really how well we are able to do that. I truly believe that we are all in this together, and your operations team is really dedicated to continue to work tirelessly to meet the needs of all of our residents during and after this global pandemic. So if you have any questions about anything I shared or potentially didn't share, please reach out to your community leaders. and they can either answer the question for you or make sure that they get to the questions to me to answer. As always, there is a COVID email address on the website. If you have any COVID-specific questions, you can send those there. So I'm going to turn it over to Lori Potter, our COO, to talk about master planning, strategic planning, and diversity and inclusion. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Lori Potter, Chief Operating Officer for UMRC in Porter Hills. Thanks, Nicole, for your thorough operations update. I'm going to cover master planning, strategic planning, and diversity today. But before I do that, I just want to say that we're almost 18 months into this affiliation. So I'm going to talk about we, and we is shore to shore, unless I specifically say it's one side or the other. I'm going to start with master planning, which is specifically for Porter Hills Village and Cook Valley Estates. It's an ongoing process, and then pandemic hit, which interrupted everything for quite a while. And we're now working on what we can afford, the number of units and the service level. Once we determine the investment in the infrastructure will be, we will seek input on amenities and common spaces. Regarding strategic planning, we hired a consultant last fall. Many of you did the surveys that were put out and had input. The board and the strategic team has reviewed that input, and they are now working on a couple of different things. One of the things that they're working on is a mission statement for Shore to Shore. So a team of board members and some staff members are working on that, and we're hopeful to share progress on that by the end of the year. And lastly, diversity. The board and strategic team is working on a formal plan, Shore to Shore. We have our market studies, and we know what the market will bear into the organization. And finally, as Nicole said, thank you for your kind words to our teams. It's really helpful. I hope that you're well. I hope that we get to see you again in the future sometime soon, real soon. And in the meantime, stay safe.